of Terraform concepts and skills, and we'll mainly focus on the open source part of HashiCorp Terraform. So we'll use the command line tool to interact with Terraform. We're not going to have a deeper look into Terraform Cloud, even though it is part of the certification program. It only wants you to briefly understand the differences between those two. And that's what the Associate certification program will cover. The actual test time, the duration of the time of the test will be about 1 hour long. So it's not a crazy long test, I would say, comparing it to some other certification programs. And again, it will simply only test beginner level knowledge, kind of like the basics of Terraform to get started. And with that, you would earn the Certified Associate badge here. That is what we're potentially aiming for. You will see, if you look at the additional resources provided by HashiCorp, the test itself will be based on multiple choice. There are also some free form answers that you might have to potentially enter here. And additionally, there are some single answered questions as well. So it doesn't necessarily have to be that your answer covers multiple answers. It could be that a single answer is correct here as well. And just for completion purposes here, you can see that is the link that I've shown to you before. If you wanted to have a deeper look at that one, you can jump directly there from the slides. So let's briefly talk about the curriculum on a high level. And what we want to cover here is roughly the curriculum and how it boils down to the test. So first of all, this is very much a theory behind tools like Terraform. How can we manage infrastructure with the help of an automation tool, not necessarily doing things, installing things manually and then configuring things manually. That is kind of like the purpose of infrastructure as code. We want to define our infrastructure and provision it with the help of a tool, which usually looks at a configuration file or multiple files, which will define what we want to provision. It will also describe all the attributes of the infrastructure that we want to provision. And that's what we're going to go through in this section of the curriculum as well. We'll talk briefly about how Terraform implements infrastructure as code. We'll also talk about how this boils down to different cloud providers. So can we apply the same configuration to multiple cloud providers as well? We'll actually see the configuration is slightly different depending on what cloud provider you use. And then we'll also talk about how Terraform will basically store the current state that we have deployed on the cloud. And you will see if we are using just the Terraform command line tool, it will create a state file, which we'll discuss in more detail. It will actually basically write down what is the current state of the infrastructure. We'll keep that state so we can compare if we were to make changes to the configuration, if a change needs to happen or not. It will definitely only make changes if a change is required. And we'll talk about the Terraform basics. So we'll talk about what a provider is. And a provider will provide us with functionality so we can define the infrastructure that we need on the cloud. We'll talk about how we can add additional functionality in Terraform with the help of a plugin-based architecture. That is how Terraform works under the hood. So we can plug in additional functionality. So if we were to want to support Google Cloud versus AWS, in those cases, we can get this functionality. And it is basically reusable functionality that has been defined in a registry. So we'll talk about that registry in more detail as well, so we can get this functionality from a central location in the form, I would say, you can think of it as a plugin. So it's kind of like enhancing the capabilities of the base Terraform platform. We'll talk about what to do if you want to use multiple providers in the configuration file of Terraform, how to define this. And then we'll also talk about kind of like the workflow. So if you wanted to get one of those providers or those plugins, what happens if you run certain commands in Terraform, and how does it basically give us the functionality? How does it find it, first of all, in the registry, and then how does it store it locally? You can see this is a little bit out of order here. Point number 4 talks about additional functionality. For example, the import command, which is probably not required if you start from scratch. So if you start with a completely new setup in the cloud, you will likely not need the import command. This is really meant for managing infrastructure that already exists on the cloud. And you want to put this under, or bring this under Terraform's management. So this command really helps us with this kind of use case. And then if you want to dig deeper into the state file, or sometimes this state is also being held on a remote machine, that, for example, would be the case if you were to use Terraform Cloud. We can run additional commands to manage the state in more detail. But again, that is a somewhat more advanced use case. We'll definitely talk about that. And we'll also have some additional exercises for both of those commands a little bit later. As I mentioned before, we want to talk about the core workflow first, and then we'll go into the more advanced use cases as well. And then here's one more point for C. This one talks about how to enable verbose logging. You will actually see that Terraform doesn't print out like internals. You can change that though if you want to. We'll learn how to change the log level of Terraform, and we'll see what the outcome will be. We'll talk about modules in more detail. So we'll talk about what a module is, how we can split up certain functionality into submodules in our project as well. And we'll also learn how to reuse existing modules that exist on the Terraform registry, how to find them, how they work internally. You will actually see that modules work with two specific, how would I call them? Not necessarily features, but basically we have to define or can define inputs and outputs for those modules to tell it what is required for this module to work properly and what does it potentially produce. Those are usually the outputs. And then we'll put it into perspective when it comes down to using modules in your own project. How can we call to child modules from the root module? And then how is the module version relevant if you're referring to it from the registry? You can see here, number 6 is pretty much the base workflow. That is the workflow that you would use if you're starting a completely new infrastructure from scratch with the help of Terraform. Sometimes that's simply not the case, or make the relevant changes with the apply command. There are some additional commands that we'll cover here as well. For example, how do I delete everything that I created before? There's also a validate command, which we'll look at a bit later, and a format command. And those will basically just validate what we have in the configuration files. Is it syntactically correct? And then does it follow the standard formatting conventions or naming conventions? We can verify that with the format command. There's one section that Terraform talks about here about maintaining state. This is a section that talks about the different kinds of state files, or what they call backends. So in the context of a local backend, we store the state in the file. This file lives alongside your project files, and we'll have a look at that. That is the default mode of operation. We'll also talk about how Terraform makes sure that other processes don't override something that is already in the process of being changed potentially. That is what we're going to cover with the state log portion here. And then we'll also talk about some options that we can configure to store the state instead on the remote backend. So if you don't want to do this locally, if you wanted to enable ourselves to work with multiple people on the team, on the infrastructure, then it's probably more helpful to store it on a remote state backend. And for example, Terraform Cloud enables us to do it. There are a couple of intricacies when it comes down to managing credentials, API keys, and any kind of sensitive information with the help of Terraform. And we'll talk about best practices when it comes down to secret management. And then there are two more sections left that are relevant for the certification, which is the use of variables and outputs. We already touched on this briefly, and so therefore we'll talk about that earlier in this course. So I mentioned before, inputs and outputs in the context of modules. Therefore, we kind of need to understand first what input variables are and output values. So we'll talk about that in more detail. You can see here there's also a slight overlap in terms of the secret management handling. We'll talk about collections and the different data types. So it's not really just about using collections. It's really about all the data types that Terraform offers. So we talk about those first, and then we'll actually show you some examples on how we can use collections for looping, for example. So if we wanted to make something happen multiple times in our configuration. So conditionals are an option in Terraform as well. So we'll talk about that in more detail. You can see there's also a difference between resources and data configuration. We'll briefly talk about that. Then we'll talk about how to write or how to use built-in functions. That's going to be an interesting topic, I think. For example, we could uppercase a specific name. We could handle something specifically as a string. There's some built-in functionality that are vast, fairly vast, that we'll have a look at. So we'll learn how to use them in a configuration file, and we'll try to bring up some specific examples that are relevant to actual configuration files, so we can make a connection here. And then lastly, we'll talk about dependency management. What this actually means is kind of like, how does the order of execution look like if we define multiple resources inside of our configuration file, and potentially one resource requires another resource to be created beforehand. I would say for the most part in Terraform, you don't have to be explicit about the specific order of creation. Terraform tries to be smart about it and tries to determine if you're requiring certain outputs of another resource as an input for another resource. So therefore, this order management already works as expected. But sometimes it's not, or it cannot be clear to Terraform because potentially you're managing part of the infrastructure without Terraform, or maybe Terraform can't really determine what the order of execution should be. In those cases, you can still define explicitly what the order of execution should be. Just to give it away, there's a specific attribute called depends on, and that is one that we can call here as well. And then lastly, as I mentioned before, we'll briefly touch on Terraform Cloud. That is more the commercial offering of Terraform, and we'll outline the main differences between what the CLI tool brings to the table versus the cloud infrastructure implementation. So we'll definitely have a bunch of slides on that as well. We'll not look at Terraform in more detail. We'll not play around or log into Terraform Cloud. In fact, there's a free tier as well if you want to play around with it, but definitely check this out yourself. But I guess if you're just trying to prepare for the exam, you will just need to understand it on a high level, on a theoretical level, and you will have to understand how the CLI tool is different from the cloud implementation. In terms of what you need to bring to the table when it comes down to Terraform, I would say if you're completely new to Terraform, you don't necessarily need to understand something. You can actually start from scratch completely. But there are some basic skills that might be helpful. And that is, I guess, really basic. So if you've been a developer or if you've been working with shell scripts in any kind of form, and that is already good enough. For Terraform, given that we run most of the operations from the command line, you will have to understand how to run terminal commands and how to operate the terminal. So I think that's fairly basic. And then maybe potentially a basic understanding of on-prem and cloud architecture. This is really more a prerequisite if you want to build infrastructure in the cloud. For real-world examples, so for example, you might want to know what an EC2 instance is in the context of AWS or on other cloud providers, what those specific terms are that you would need to use that are potentially only available to a specific cloud provider. But if you're completely new to the topic, I think we're still good here. I would say you can even pass the certification program without a deep understanding of those topics. But ultimately, if you want to be hands-on, if you want to use this knowledge or Terraform specifically in a real project, then you will have to understand or dig a bit deeper on what you need to create. What do you need provision on the cloud? In terms of preparing for the exam, I would say read through the full documentation at least just once. You will actually see that we'll refer to the documentation quite a bit. We will go back and forth as I demonstrate some of the topics here on my screen. But keep in mind, opening up another browser tab for the documentation is not allowed. So therefore, just have a better understanding of it in general. There are actually 3 different links that I wanted to show you in preparation for the exam that I found super helpful, and all of which are provided by HashiCorp. Which one is helpful here? Study guide, and this one talks about how to best prepare for it. So we'll give you some additional links on the individual topics. They not only link to videos and blog posts and documentation. You can use this as a separate reference, so kind of like as a guideline for understanding individual topics of the certification program. So definitely check this out. This is almost like a way to reference specific documentation and then dig deeper from there. There's also a review of the exam. That's another guide here that talks a bit about the mapping between topics to documentation and additional tutorials. So that you might find this to be very helpful. And then lastly, we have some sample questions here that should at least give you the impression of how those questions are phrased. I mentioned before, it's not just multiple choice. They have different formats. For example, here we have one question where the answer is either true or false. We have a multiple choice, which means you can have one or many answers to those questions. And then there could even be a hint that multiple answers are correct. So it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a single answer. And then lastly, I believe there's also a kind of like a free form answer. So for example, in this case, what command would you type? They don't provide you with any options, but ultimately you would have to type in what the answer should be. So good mix of different questions. So keep in mind that those are not just all offered as answers. And let's see where we stand with your questions. Let me see where we are here. And both questions are more advanced right now. I would say let's talk about those specific topics because they will come up as well. We will talk about how to control and sync any additional changes that have been made outside of Terraform. So that is a topic that I mentioned before. That is where the import command comes into play. So we'll definitely talk about that more towards the end. You will see in my slide deck, and more specifically, if you already wanted to look at that, have a look at exercise number 12. And that is, in fact, the last one for today. So if you don't want to sit in until tomorrow, this is kind of like the two commands that you would have to work with. So if you were to create infrastructure that is not managed by Terraform yet, or that has been made in general, you will have to look into those two different commands. Optimally, you would have all the infrastructure managed by Terraform, but sometimes you're transitioning over to Terraform, or you made some manual changes. In those cases, it gets a little bit more complex. But the two commands that are important are import and the state command. So have a look at those. And then there's another question on managing multiple environments. For example, development, staging, and production. And you can see this is more a question in the context of a CI/CD pipeline. And I will give you some pointers on additional tools that we can bring in here, for example, how to test this. So I would say like the second question is more out of scope for the actual certification program, but I can definitely give you some additional pointers during the break when everybody else is working on these specific exercises here. So hold on a bit. We'll definitely want to build the foundation for everybody else, but I will try to answer your questions as we go along. All right, any more questions about the exam so far? If not, we'll jump in and talk about the first topic of the exam, which would be the theory behind infrastructure as code. I guess for everybody that's already using Terraform, this might be a little bit boring, but given that we're preparing for the certification program specifically, I want to make sure that we cover this as well. You will see this is not super hands-on in any kind of form with the help of Terraform. It really is just the theory behind how Terraform or what guidelines Terraform follows. All right, looks like there's no question right now, so we'll just move on and talk about infrastructure as code, also referred to IAC.